Hello and welcome to The Print. Today we have a renowned journalist, author, and political commentator from Canada, Terry Milewski, to speak to us about the diplomatic row that has reached new heights between Canada and India ever since Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made an explosive claim on the floor of the Canadian Parliament, saying that Canadian authorities are investigating a possible link between Indian agents and the killing of Sikh militant Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Terry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the invitation.
So I'll just get right to it. We've seen a lot of developments in the last 3 days, tit for tat expulsion of diplomats, travel advisories from either country. And now, in fact, a briefing was held by the spokesperson of the Indian Foreign Ministry, who announced that there would be a downsizing of the Canadian mission here in Delhi so that it is in parity with the Indian mission in Canada. So first off, Terry, do you expect further downgradation of ties, such as perhaps the expelling of top diplomats? And do you think this could spiral out of control?
Yes, I do. I do think that it's going to get worse before it gets better. That's the nature of escalation, isn't it? When the other guy escalates, you got to escalate too, or you look like a wimp. And there's a lot of macho involved in these tit for tat expulsions. Make sure that you're being as tough as the other. It has its own momentum. In other words, it's kind of out of human hands almost when this train rolls away and gets away from you, and it's hard to put on the brakes and say, okay, hold on, that's enough. It takes statesmanship to do that. We're obviously not at that stage yet. Every day there's another escalation. Now they're kicking out more diplomats in New Delhi. We'll have to do the same at the Canadian end, and so on. So what's going to stop it is, I guess, is what everyone is asking. How do we turn this ship around? And I think that the answer has been obvious from the very start. And that is, there is a hole in the heart of the Canadian Prime Minister's presentation to the Parliament. And that is the lack of evidence. He has got to say, what has he got that proves his case? What has he got that shows that agents of the Indian government were involved or linked to or potentially linked to the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Surrey, British Columbia on June the 18th? And if he doesn't produce that, all of this noise that we're talking about, the travel bans and the visas and the diplomatic tit for tat, and the picturing of all the gangsters that Canada is allegedly sheltering, all of that's going to be noise, and that's all background noise, and it's interesting to talk about, but it doesn't touch the core issue. Why we are here is because Trudeau made this incendiary accusation, and so far he has not proved it. He needs to do that.
What do you make of sort of the reactions of the Five nations? We've seen statements from the White House, the UK government, Australia, and New Zealand, of course. So what do you make of the fact that reports came out that Trudeau's government was sort of trying to push for a joint statement to come out of the Five Eyes commenting on Nijjar's killing, and the fact that that did not happen?
Well, it certainly seems to be the case that the Allies are doing their best to be nice to Canada and to avoid, if at all possible, raining on Trudeau's parade. But as you point out, it hasn't been completely successful. What we've got, the White House, for example, called the CBC, for example, my old employer, and said, well, these reports in the Washington Post about us, being reluctant to support Canada, absolutely not true. We're deeply concerned about these allegations. What does that mean? Does it mean you believe them? Well, if you believe them, you'd tell us. But it's not clear to me at this point, from what few leaks we've had, that the Allies even have any details. Supposedly, for example, the Prime Minister briefed the opposition leaders within Canada before making a statement in the House of Commons. But those leaders now say, well, I didn't really hear anything that he didn't say publicly. Oh, Well, what did he tell the allies? Well, he told the allies enough for the statement that I just described to you from the United States, that they're deeply concerned. The British minister, Mr. Cleverly, has said that, well, he insists there should be a full investigation into the Canadians' very serious allegations. Well, yeah, they're serious allegations. He's not saying he believes them. He's not saying, none of them said that they would stand behind Trudeau in the shot, behind his shoulder, looking stern and nodding at Trudeau's expression of outrage at what the Indians had done. So they are avoiding raining on Trudeau's parade, as I say, but they are also avoiding a wholehearted endorsement that, yep, we've seen the evidence and it's good, and India has a lot to answer for. They have stopped well short of that. And remember that a lot of this may not have much to do with the substance of what the evidence is, and more to do with the sheer political clout of the competing parties. Canada, you could say that's the largest democracy in the world, as well as India, because it's the biggest in land area, although, of course, the population figures are no comparison. But there's no question, is there, that a rising India, now the most populous country in the world, has a lot more political clout. So if the Americans are thinking, well, you know, the Canadians are our traditional neighbors and allies, we're very close to Canada, we don't want to jeopardize that relationship, but we're not going to step on India's toes. They didn't want to do that. And that's not going to change, as I say.
Sorry,
that's not going to change.
Right. Just to push you a little more on that, we did see the Australian Prime Minister talk a lot about rule of law. And there are, a lot of editorials coming out of newspapers, which also mention briefly that a head of government would not make these claims unless he was sure of it or he had some credible evidence. What is your take on that?
Well, I mean, that's a natural reaction, and I've heard that a lot too, that, well, Trudeau would never have done this. The leader of a G7 country would never have made this outrageous allegation unless he had good, hard evidence. Okay, so two things on that. First, we haven't heard it, and I'm an agnostic until I do. Second, I suspect that there's a reason we haven't heard it. That is, it ain't so hot. Because look at it a little bit more closely. Trudeau is saying that he's demanding Indian full cooperation with the investigation. It sounds to me as though his investigation is not complete. It's a potential link. It's credible allegations. He's not saying we're all the way there, although he's acting as if he were. He's acting by kicking out an Indian diplomat. He's acting as though he does have a conclusion. But it doesn't sound as though the investigation is complete without India's cooperation. Perhaps there is a piece of evidence, there is a name, there is a document, a phone call, something like that. Some piece of evidence that is in Indian hands and that they're not coughing up. That's certainly a plausible scenario. I'm not reporting it as a fact. I'm saying that that's one thing that comes to mind, why he might need Indian cooperation in concluding the investigation. Well, that doesn't seem very likely to be forthcoming, does it? It doesn't sound from the Indian side, they're calling the allegations absurd. It doesn't sound as though they're going to open all the doors, produce all the witnesses, and say, yeah, go ahead, interrogate our guys all you want. We're not going to help you make your case, Canada. I don't think that's going to happen. So I still think that this is a matter of relative clout, that India has the advantage in that sense. I also believe that Prime Minister Modi is in the know. Remember that if Trudeau does not satisfy us by producing his evidence publicly, and he says, oh, it's classified, I don't want to interfere with the investigation, heaven forbid, although, of course, he's already done so. And let us say then that Modi looks at the situation and says, well, I know what he's got, and it's rubbish. So he can easily step up and say, well, Trudeau isn't revealing what he's got because it's weak. Now I'm going to show you how weak it is. And here's what he said, and here's why it's wrong. That guy wasn't in the neighborhood or whatever. Modi may very well be in the know. And remember that also that the two governments have been speaking to each other about this matter for weeks before the G2. They knew before the G20, I mean, they knew before the G20. Sounds like there's only two people there. it sounds like they knew long before the G20 that the trade talks were going to be on ice, and that relations between the two countries would be in a deep freeze very soon, and they were right about that part.
Now, just to zoom out for a second, India seems to be in an, it's not seems, is in a diplomatic row with a G7 country. It has expelled a diplomat from a Western country for the first time since 2014. That time it was with the US. And now, right after the briefing provided by the Indian Foreign Ministry spokesperson, it seems that we are starting to use the kind of language we usually reserve for Pakistan by calling Canada a safe haven for terrorists, extremists, organized crime, and individuals who incite violence. So you talked about how are we going to turn this ship around. What do you make of the kind of language we are now using against a developed nation, a G7 country, that, you know, we've had sort of a mistrust with dating back decades?
Well, I find it very interesting, but not so much for what you hear, but for what you do not hear. Here's what I mean. That India is certainly making a great deal of noise about how terrible the Canadian situation is and how Canada harbors terrorists and gangsters, and we're going to hold them to account and so forth. And this makes good copy. It makes it's work for journalists. It gets you on TV. Well, what about what they are not saying? What they are not saying is what we were just discussing. What they're not saying is, by the way, on the core issue, on the reason that we're here at all, we have the information that the Canadians gave us, and here's why it's rubbish. We're not hearing that. They're talking about everything else. There's a lot of noise and distraction there. And I'm suggesting that we weed out the signal from the noise, and that the signal may lie in what they are not saying. It would be easy, after all. I mean, just imagine that when Trudeau said that he met Modi, that he raised this matter with Modi, I quote, in no uncertain terms. And you cannot imagine, and I cannot imagine, that Mr. Modi sat there like a potted plant and didn't ask any questions when Trudeau brought this up to him. He would have said, of course, he would have asked questions. He would have said, what are you talking about? What is your evidence? I can't imagine that he wouldn't know something more than the average Joe right now, because he would have asked that question for certain. So he knows something about what the Canadians have. So why doesn't he say, okay, well, here it is, and it's nonsense for these reasons, and kill it dead? Trudeau would be blown out of the water if that happened. But Modi's not doing that. Instead, there's a lot of noise about other problems with Canada and the terrorists and the visas, and what about the students and kicking out more diplomats. And well, it fills up our story, doesn't it? But it doesn't answer the core question. What's the evidence?
Well, so far we know there was an Indian intelligence officer that was expelled, Pavan Kumar Rai. And what we know from Nijjar's killing was that he was shot on 18th June outside a temple by two unidentified gunmen who fled in a 2008 Toyota Camry. So what is the link between Pavan Kumar Rai, potentially, and the two unidentified assailants? And what the assumption that you're suggesting is that this link has been provided to the Indian government, who are not revealing it?
No, what I'm suggesting is that the link isn't so good. You know, that there's some evidence there that Modi is not discussing for reasons best known to him. I'm not suggesting that the link exists necessarily. It may be that Modi is in possession of information to show that the link is not there. That's what I'm suggesting. And it would be interesting to hear him on that point. But let me just pick up on your word, unidentified. You said that these people who actually did the shooting are not identified. You're correct. The police have not uttered a word about this. The last time the police in Surrey spoke on this matter, they said that no, they had not made any conclusion that there was some link, as alleged, to the Indian government. remember also, I mean, so that certainly presents a problem, does it not? That if you don't even know who the shooters are yet, how do you know who paid them? This was a contract hit. This followed the pattern of a contract hit similar to the murder of Pavan Singh Malik, an Air India bombing suspect who was acquitted at the trial in 2005. The murder of Mr. Malik in July of last year. So the two masked men, they shoot you as you sit in your car, they run off, and there's a third guy at the getaway car. Then you later find the getaway car in flames because they think that'll get rid of any fingerprints or DNA. So if the police don't know who shot Mr. Nijjar, how do they know who was behind the shooters? That's a puzzle to me. And the fact that the police have said nothing about this investigation and it's up to the Prime Minister to reveal this, that seems odd to me. And there are alternative theories for the death of Mr. Nijjar. There are theories, for example, that this was a local vendetta and that he had something to do perhaps with the killing of Mr. Malik, who was cozying up to the Modi government, an act of treachery on his former Khalistani friends. He also had a lawsuit, a business dispute. He had a lawsuit with Mr. Nijjar. Both were seen in interviews trashing each other, insulting each other. There was bad blood between the two, and so that's why this theory grew up, that perhaps Mr. Malik died because of Mr. Nijjar, and perhaps Mr. Nijjar died as an act of revenge, a local vendetta, in other words, a settling of accounts between people who lived on the edge of the law in Surrey, which would not be unknown. I'm not endorsing this theory. I'm just saying that there are two factors here. The letter to Modi, this is in public, and the lawsuit. These are pieces of evidence. That is something that the Trudeau theory, that it's all down to the Indian government, lacks. Where are the shots? You may say that it's not very good evidence, but at least it's something. But as I say, it's the hole in the heart of the Prime Minister's presentation, and it needs to be filled, because if he can't back this up, if he doesn't have the goods, Trudeau's finished. I mean, he's already on thin ice. The polls say that the Conservatives would form the next government if there were an election tomorrow. So I don't see how he would survive if he stuck his neck out this far and failed to back it up. I don't think he would survive politically.
And lastly, Terry, I know you have to go very soon. I might return to a little bit of that noise you were talking about just now, but we've seen a lot by now about how the Sikh diaspora in Canada is a key vote bank for the Liberal Party, as well as other parties. That has been well documented. But my question is, since you've written about the space given to Sikh extremists in Canada, why is it that, Canada doesn't sort of enforce laws about glorifying Sikh militants, be it
very good question. Yeah.
Be it Parmar or be it Bhindranwale. The UK has an anti-terrorism act where you can actually be put in jail for even glorifying a crime, or sort of it's become a crime now, for glorifying any criminal activity or terrorism. Going through sort of the Canadian legislation, you have a section in your criminal code about inciting violence through hate speech. Your Terrorism Act also covers glorifying terrorism. Is it that these pieces of legislation are not strong enough, or is it that they are not being enforced the way that we've seen in other countries like the UK?
I think it's both. The UK, you're right to point out, did update its legislation in 2006. So 17 years ago, the British led the way. The other European countries have adopted similar provisions, which directly and explicitly make the glorification of terrorism a criminal offense. But Canada doesn't have that language. Canada, you're right, has language about inciting hate. But that's focused on groups. If you incite hate against an identifiable group, identifiable group, a color, a religion, whatever, an ethnic background. If you incite hatred against a group, that's a crime in Canada. What if you're one Indian diplomat and you're not a member of a group? Suddenly you're not covered. But you would be covered if the government had a law that was explicit about glorifying terrorism, and if it also enforced it. Remember that this is a weakness in Canada. This is a genuine problem in Canada. It's not just some distraction. It's at the key. It's at the core of the Indian complaints about Canada's pandering and indulgence of militants of various kinds in Canada. And it's normalized in this country to have, for example, life-size glamour photos with ceremonial sword and ornate turban of the Air India bomber, Talvinder Parmar, the worst mass murderer in Canadian history, stuck on the outside of an important Gurdwara in Surrey, British Columbia. It is normal in Canada to have people marching down the street with posters naming and shaming and showing the photographs of Indian diplomats and offering rewards, cash rewards, for identifying their home addresses. So, I mean, God help us if some kid gets the message and has a gun. It's not going to be pretty. This is in the incitement of violence. It is normal in Canada, and politicians said not quite nothing, but almost nothing about a truck going through the streets of Toronto in a martyrs parade, reenacting with life-size figures and celebrating the assassination of Indira Gandhi in 1984, with plenty of red paint splashed upon Mrs. Gandhi's sari so that kids can really get the message. This bloody event is one we're proud of. This is to be applauded. Make sure you bring the kids to see this. So it's a problem in Canada that we've let it go so far that all of these things are accepted. They wouldn't be in other countries, and I think the Indians are absolutely right to complain about it, and they've had enough. I still say that it doesn't touch Trudeau's allegations about the murder of Nijjar, but it's not irrelevant.
So maybe a way forward, if there was a direction in which these bilateral relations could go positively, is perhaps if perhaps something on the glorification of such individuals was addressed. Yeah. Because yes, that seems to be the core of it that has sort of propelled what we're seeing today in Canadian politics.
I mean, it doesn't take too much, I don't think, for Canada to step up and do what, for example, the Prime Minister of Britain, Rishi Sunak, did at the G20, where he said, look, we're not, made a very strong statement that we're not going to allow any space for Khalistani extremism in the UK. And he does have that legislation to back him up. But Trudeau couldn't say that. But if he did say that, or something similar, instead of, oh, well, it's freedom of expression, nothing we can do, that kind of thing, then it would go a long way, I think, to persuading the Indians, finally Canada gets it. Because that's really the problem that has been developing throughout this growth of sort of terrorist iconography, if I can put it that way. That has been looming all along. The failure of Canadian politicians to be curious enough, to be sophisticated enough to get what Indians are complaining about. They still think, for example, it's quite common for Canadian politicians to assume that Sikhs are all Khalistanis. So that if we want to get elected, we must say nice things about Khalistan. Which is absolute nonsense. As you know, there's very little support for Khalistan, even in the diaspora, where the flame still burns clearly. But certainly, they have no idea that in India, the level of support is so small you can hardly read the figures. They don't know about how the separatists in Punjab routinely win 0 seats every time there's an election. So all of that background whereby Canadian politicians are simply naive and gullible. Say, well, these Khalistanis, they invite me to the Vaisakhi parade, and they seem like wonderful people, and the food is great. And I didn't know about these floats going by with portraits garlanded in gold tinsel of gun-toting martyrs and assassins. I was looking the other way. And besides, they're going to vote for me. It's a great little arrangement we have. Indians, of course, look at that and they say, how naive can you be? And they're right.
Well, on that note, Terry, I have to thank you for taking out the time to speak to us during your busy day. We'll be covering these developments very closely, and I'm sure you will be too. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. I enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye for now.